It's my pleasure to have Dr. George Sledge from the Stanford University School of Medicine to present on how to present clinical research results effectively. Dr. George will be joining virtually.
Nietzsche, thank you very much, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I've learned a great deal listening to you. I was asked, as you've heard, to give a presentation on how to present clinical research results effectively, or in my words, how to talk good. Next slide, please. Here are some brief disclosures. Next slide, please. So here's what I'll be talking about today. First, I'm going to be talking about types of talks that you might be giving. Second, I'll be talking about some technical aspects associated with those talks. And then finally and briefly, I'll be talking about some talk etiquette. Next slide, please. Well, in general, you'll be asked during your career to give 3 types of talks. I'll be spending the majority of my time talking about the short scientific presentation, the sort of talk you'd be giving at San Antonio when you're presenting your data. But also talk briefly about the long talk, and then also even a little bit more briefly about the job talk, something that will be of great importance to some of you in coming years. Next slide, please. Well, the short scientific presentation, I'm sure, is familiar to all of you. This is a highly stereotyped presentation, and let me repeat this. This is highly stereotyped. It'll begin with the title and a conflict of interest statement. You'll then go into an introduction or background slide or slides. You'll talk to the audience about the methods that you used in your presentation and indeed in your study. You'll talk about the results of the study. You'll provide some discussion and perhaps some brief acknowledgements, and these will be followed by a question and answer period. So because this is stereotyped, you have fewer degrees of freedom than you might in other forms of talks. Next slide, please. Well, let's begin with the title slide. I think, it stands to reason that the longer your title, the shorter the rest of your talk. So I tend to prefer short titles rather than long ones, so this is certainly up to you. But it's important to realize that the title is not the punchline of your talk. You want to save your results for the results section. The title should be, in essence, a brief description of what you're going to talk about, but not what the results of those are. This will sound silly, but make sure your co-authors' names are spelled correctly. I cannot tell you the number of times where I've seen this happen, where someone has misspelled someone's name. Moving on to the conflict of interest statement, take this seriously. Check the rules of the organization and err on the side of over-reporting. Next slide, please. Now, once we're past the title slide and the conflict of interest statement, you move to your introductory slide, where you're providing the background that's needed by the audience. Here, my suggestion is to be concise. The audience does not need a complete history of the disease. I cannot tell you how many talks I've seen that started off saying something along the lines of, breast cancer is a very bad disease, or triple-negative breast cancer is a very bad disease. The audience knows this, particularly at San Antonio. Instead, what you want to focus on in your background is what's the main problem or the important question that is to be addressed by the study. Or to put it another way, why should we care about what you're talking about? Because if we don't care about what you're talking about, then we're going to go out in the hall in your talk and speak to our friends instead. So you want to make this as compelling as possible and as brief as possible. Moving on to the methods section, you of course heard in previous talks a great deal about how one prepares a study. The preparation of the study, of course, should go into your methods discussion. What is the study population that's being looked at in the clinical trial that you're doing? This is very important, of course, because minor variations in inclusion and exclusion criteria can have major effects in terms of the outcomes of many studies, as I've certainly discovered over the years. Then you want to move on to what are the questions being studied in your study? And in particular, what are the predefined statistical endpoints? Are these endpoints primary endpoints or are they secondary endpoints? And again, bear in mind that you'll be judged by and large based on the primary endpoints of your trial. What are the power calculations? What are the statistics associated with the trial? All too often, I see people in giving presentations not spend enough time in terms of statistical endpoints. But at the end of the day, it's the statistics that make a study worthwhile or not. Finally, how are they being studied? In other words, what does the patient flow look like during the course of the study? And here, of course, the schema is your best friend, and having an intelligible schema, one that is not too detailed, but one provides enough information for your audience is key. All of these go into your methods. Next slide, please. Moving on now to the results. The primary endpoint is the primary endpoint. And that is to say, when you design the trial, your primary endpoint presumably was telling you what was the most important endpoint. And the statistics in most trials are based around that primary endpoint. Statistics around secondary endpoints tend to be softer and less meaningful. And indeed, the secondary endpoints themselves should be less important than the primary endpoint. So bear that in mind when you're giving a presentation. One of the more embarrassing presentations I ever saw in my life was an investigator who had a primary endpoint and 8 secondary endpoints. One of those secondary endpoints was positive, and the investigator got tortured by the audience for focusing most of his talk on that secondary endpoint. Because we're talking about clinical research, toxicity matters. Physicians, when they go into the clinic after hearing your talk, need to know whether or not their patients have anything important that will be likely to happen to them as a result of a new therapeutic. So toxicities that are common, toxicities that are important or dangerous, and toxicities that are unusual are things that your investigators listening to your talk need to know. Always bear in mind when in presenting your talk that you have an ethical responsibility to patients and to the truth, just as you would if you were sitting in front of a patient in the clinic. Finally, in looking at the results, don't drown the audience in data. Now, I will tell you that different investigators feel differently about this in giving presentations. But frankly, a 10-minute presentation is just not enough time to go into any great depth into a large amount of data. So you need to focus, to my mind, on the data that you think is important. Next slide, please. Next, we move on to the discussion. Now, the discussion section is your chance to interpret your data. Usually you begin your discussion session by focusing on the major takeaways from your talk. Now, there's a large pedagogic literature that says that when you give a talk and then come back to those who are in the audience 3 or 4 weeks later and ask them what they remembered about your talk, it's rare for them to remember more than 2 or 3 things. So you better make sure that those 2 or 3 things are the major takeaways that you wanted them to remember. When you're presenting your discussion, you want to summarize rather than simply repeating your data. Don't bore them by going over the same thing in exactly the same way as you did before. Place your data in context. It is rare in a talk for your data to be the only data in the field. So if you have a major advance over something that has come prior, place it within that context. If it's not different, well, place it in that context as well. The discussion is a good time to talk about future directions, such as, based on the results of this phase 2 trial, we have launched a large phase 3 trial in our cooperative group. It's very reasonable that the audience knows where you're going from here. And finally, be objective in your discussion. Always important to think honestly about your own data. Next slide, please. Now, there's some do-nots in a discussion. And so let me mention some of these do-nots. Do not ask your data to carry more weight than they can bear. Do not focus solely on positive secondary endpoints, particularly if there's negative endpoints or a negative primary endpoint. Do not fall in love with your data or with a drug. There'll be new data and new drugs next year. And trust me, your data will not be the end of the story. And then finally, try to avoid what I call arrow attractants, those things that will provoke an angry response by someone in the audience. My favorite one here, of course, is when someone says that their research represents the new standard of care. This is an editorial that I think the audience is best suited to make a determination on, not you. Next slide, please. Now, many of us, of course, will include an acknowledgement slide. Science is a collective enterprise, so it's reasonable to briefly thank those who made your work possible. This shouldn't go on for minutes and minutes, but it's certainly reasonable to spend 30 seconds or so thanking. It's also reasonable, of course, to thank the patients who entered the trial and, of course, put their own bodies on the line for your research. Next slide, please. Now, finally, in the short talk, of course, is the question and answer period. And I've always considered this the most dangerous part of a talk. And this is the place where I've seen the most reputations lost over the years. You've spent several years conducting a study, you just spent 10 to 12 minutes presenting your data, and now in the next 5 minutes or so, you can get into a lot of trouble. So be prepared. And by be prepared, I mean, think in terms of what your audience might be asking you in the Q&A period. Speak to your friends about this. Maybe they'll know something that you've not thought about. It's always reasonable to, if you need to give yourself a little bit more time, to repeat the question and perhaps repeat it in terms that are more to your liking. When you answer the question, it's always reasonable to say, I don't know, because if you don't know, you shouldn't pretend that you know. And finally, don't be arrogant or defensive. People are genuinely on your side up till the moment they consider you arrogant or defensive. Try and be polite, even if the way in which the question was phrased was impolite. Try and show that you are above everything when you're answering a question. Some important points about the short presentation. Stay on time. You're part of a program session where everything is timed down to a minute, so you need to stay on time. Again, this is a very stereotyped sort of lecture. Don't try to be too clever. Let the data speak for itself by and large. Before you give this talk, practice, practice, practice. And in particular, I would suggest practicing in front of others within your own institution. By the way, it's so much better to be beaten up at home than it is to be beaten up on the road. And many people listening to you in your own institution will be able to give you pointers. Sometimes those pointers are pointers about style, but in many cases, they actually are raising good questions about the data that you would best be prepared to answer. And here is a case where, if you're allowed to, you might even have some backup slides available if you think there are going to be some obvious questions that may be asked, and if the symposium that you're in will allow those backup slides. Now, let's move on to the long talk. And the long talk is the talk that perhaps might be 40 minutes or an hour that you're giving perhaps in your institution, but commonly, of course, when you're on the road speaking at another institution. I think the first thing to bear in mind when you're giving a long talk is that you are the expert just by virtue of being up in front of the audience. So try and always be comfortable with your data and with what you're presenting. The long talk is different than the short talk, and that is to say it is not stereotyped. You can put into it whatever you want. But what I usually suggest to those I'm teaching about giving a long talk is that they try and create a story arc. And that is to say, you're trying to give someone the history of the field, what's going on currently, and where you think the field will be going in the near future, for instance, would be a good story arc. In general, as in all talks, less is more. Don't go into mind-numbing detail about every trivial fact. Again, the audience won't remember it next week. They will remember being bored to tears. This is a place where it's okay to be clever or to be funny, even to tell jokes if you want to, if they're appropriate. Though I will tell you that humor is one of those things that frequently doesn't travel very, very well. So you have to be careful on this. Before you give the talk, time your talk. I always kind of assume that when someone asked me to speak, for instance, for an hour, that I should be up and talking for an entire hour. But of course, when you actually start giving these talks, what you realize is that no talk ever starts on time. People drag into the room if it's a lunch talk. The person who introduces you gets flowery, and time is cut into. And at the end of the day, you end up rushing through your talk. No one has ever complained about a talk that ended early. Allow time for questions. This is frequently your best chance to have good communications with your audience and for them to learn something above and beyond. Next slide, please. Let's talk briefly about the job talk. Now, in a job talk, and many of you, if you've not already done so, will be doing so in the near future. In the job talk, you are selling yourself. You are trying to encourage people to hire you. So you must ask yourself, what is it that they actually want when they're hearing you give a job talk? And I would suggest that there are a number of things. First and simplest, of course, is domain mastery. If you are looking at a job where they're wanting someone who is going to be an expert on HER2-positive breast cancer or on genomics or on translational research, you must make sure that you have domain mastery before you get up and give the talk. Because, of course, if you don't, it's highly unlikely that they'll hire you. But I think this is a very low bar and certainly not what I look for when I listen to job talks. I am particularly interested in creativity and productivity. Is the person speaking to me, have they already done something, albeit though they're early in their career, have they already done something that is impressive? Have they been involved specifically in the development of a clinical or a translational trial? Are their thought processes creative? Are they someone who's able to think about where the field is going? I'm also interested, of course, in whether or not someone is able to think on their feet. Thinking on your feet, of course, is important when you're in a lively scientific discussion, and certainly is part of what we do as academicians. And finally, I want to know that that person is, to put it in very simple terms, not a twit. Again, as I mentioned in the short talk, if someone comes across as arrogant or defensive as part of their job talk, they're probably going to be arrogant and defensive when I'm dealing with them on a daily basis going forward. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some technical aspects that are involved in giving talks. I like to suggest to everyone that they try and use what I would call the back of the room rule. And that is to say, imagine yourself in San Antonio, sitting in back of Hall D, looking way up front and looking at someone's slides. If I can't read those slides, am I likely to understand what's being presented? Your slides should be readable from the back of the room. Your slides, as much as possible, it's not always possible, but as much as possible, should avoid clutter. I would suggest to you that you use as large a font size as is reasonable on the slide. It doesn't have to dominate the slide, but if it's larger, I might be able to read it better. You want to minimize the number of lines on the slide. If you have more than 8 lines or so on a slide, it's very hard to imagine reading that slide in a minute or so. The headings to the slide should be smart ones, descriptive, straightforward, easy to read. Your slides should have good contrast. I'm using black on white today. Yellow on blue works quite well. But make sure that you have good contrast so that your slide is easy to read. And then finally, of course, try and be as concise as possible. Next slide, please. Now, I think the best description about concision comes from Benjamin Franklin. And even though this is an example from 250 years ago, I think it's still appropriate. Benjamin Franklin was talking about a man named John Thompson, who decided he wanted to put some storefront advertising out in front of his store. So he originally thought about making a sign that said, John Thompson, hatter, makes and sells hats for ready money. And he said, well, I can be more concise than that. And he said, John Thompson makes and sells hats for ready money. Then he thought, I can be even better than that. So he said, John Thompson makes and sells hats. And finally getting it down to John Thompson sells hats. And then in a final moment of brilliance, and here we go to the next slide, the final version, John Thompson with this colorful hat. And while this may be perhaps even a bit too concise, hopefully you get the idea. You want your slide to be as much as possible attractive, concise, but still getting the idea across. Next slide, please. Now, here's an example of everything possible to go wrong on a particular slide. Here you can see that the contrast is awful on the right side. Black on red is a particularly inappropriate way to do a slide. It's essentially unreadable. This slide has too many lines. I think I counted 16 lines. Again, you just simply can't read that. The pictures here are all jumbled together. They're not particularly well described. They're basically very difficult to interpret and easily can have been put across 3 or 4 slides, blown up, had good headings, and been much more easy to read. I don't know who made this slide. I hope it was someone who was making it for something other than a job talk, but this is the perfect example of a slide that you don't want to do. So next slide, please. Now, instead, let me show you the slide of the world's most accurate pie chart. And here you see pie I have not eaten and pie I have eaten. Now look at this and think of this in comparison to the previous slide that I showed you. This is concise, it's intelligible, it provides data in a ready to read format, absolutely intelligible and absolutely quite memorable. So as much as possible, put some thought into what's going into your slides to make them more intelligible, more concise, easy to understand, and perhaps, as in this case, even a little bit humorous. Next slide, please. Some talk etiquette. I think it's important when you're giving a talk to face the audience and make eye contact. Indeed, one of my sorrows in not being on the stage with you in San Antonio is, of course, I can't see your eyes today. You need to be enthusiastic and vary the tone of your voice, particularly in a long talk. You don't want folks drifting off. And this is a signal to them that they should pay attention. When you're giving the talk, don't pace up and down the stage, but also don't stand so rigid that they think that you're an immovable object. Don't wave your pointer around. Boy, the number of talks that I've seen over the years where the laser pointer has dashed over the screen as if the poor speaker had epilepsy. Don't take a lot of drinks, sipping continuously while you're giving your talk. Don't do things that distract the audience from your talk. You want them focused on what you are saying, not particularly on what you are doing. Next slide, please. Some further talk etiquette. Know your audience. It's always important to know who you're speaking to. Am I speaking to a lay audience that is not particularly interested in my jargon, but is deeply passionate about the subject? Am I speaking to a very advanced group that knows all of the jargon, has a high degree of understanding of the content matter, and therefore may require less in the way of background? That's very important before you get up on the stage. Know your room. Are you speaking to a small room or a large room? You may be interacting differently with the audience depending on the size of the room and the shape of the room. And finally, know the podium. I always like to go up to the podium and look around the audience from the podium, but I also like to just very simply understand how the clicker works before I go up to the podium. It saves time once you get on the stage. And indeed, speak to the AV guy, if at all possible, and see if there's any tricks that you need to know. This can save you time and trouble. Next slide, please. And then finally, always end by thanking your audience. And so with that, I will say thank you ever so much, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sledge, for the excellent presentation. Receiving a lot of comments and questions. The first one is, in what ways do pharmaceutical representatives commonly share clinical data that clinicians and scientists in training should be aware of? Is it the same as a general presentation, or is there often spin that clinicians should be aware of?
Well, of course, it depends on the pharmaceutical company. If a pharmaceutical company is sharing data with you, ultimately you have to understand that they're choosing that data because they hope to have you sell a drug, or hope sell a drug to you. And of course, pharmaceutical companies have gotten exceptionally good at this over the years, and trust me, they know very well how to present slides. If you meet with a pharmaceutical representative, again, be aware that they have an agenda. There's nothing wrong with having an agenda, but just make sure that your agenda is focused on the patients, not on their drug.
The next question is about posters. What are your thoughts about changing the way scientific posters are presented? Do you think that the standard layout, as we see posters now, are effective, and any suggestions how to improve posters?
Well, again, one of the issues that I always see in posters, and I must say posters are maybe my favorite part of most scientific meetings. One of the problems with most posters, again, is that they fail what I call the back of the room rule. And that is to say, at a poster, if I'm standing, as I frequently am, in a crowd of folks around the poster, and I'm, say, 5 feet away from the poster, can I actually read what's on the poster? Posters frequently just simply have too much on them. So again, to the extent that you can make your poster more intelligible, more readable, less data, less full of really compact, tight data sets that you just simply can't interpret or read, I think you're better off. I think posters are a good place where you can tell a story. When I stand in front of a poster, I'll frequently like to take someone through the poster. So think of your poster as a journey where you're going from what is the problem I was trying to look at, how did I approach it, what are my results, and what are my conclusions, and perhaps lay out the poster along those lines. But at the end of the day, posters are very workaday things. You're given a small amount of space by the organizing committee. You just need to make sure that you make good use of that space.
Great. 2 more questions. One is about pitfalls to avoid. Could you comment on pitfalls to avoid 1 or 2 examples of blunders that you've seen over the years for presentations?
So again, I think I already mentioned probably the worst one I've ever seen, which is an investigator who, in getting up and discussing the results of a phase 3 trial, comparing two drugs in the same class of drugs, had a statistical plan that had a primary endpoint and literally 8 secondary endpoints. This investigator spent 5 minutes of the introduction saying why he thought one drug was better than the other drug before he ever got to his data. And then in presenting the data, he pretty much ignored the primary endpoint, which was flat out negative, and chose the 1 secondary endpoint out of 8 that was positive in favor of the drug that he liked. And by the time he was through giving the talk, and I was the discussant for the talk, so I remember this well, in the Q&A period, there was a line stretching to the door and he was tortured. The other case that I saw where someone got into trouble in a hurry was a case where the statistical plan for this particular phase 3 trial involved borrowing patients from another trial and using those patients in the control arm for this trial. This was a somewhat unusual statistical plan, where the audience wasn't quite used to it. This was brought up during the question and answer period. The speaker got immediately defensive and started arguing with the audience. And this went very quickly downhill, where the audience, in essence, started laughing at the investigator as he got more and more defensive. These sorts of things can damage your reputation. You should always be polite. If someone disagrees with you, it's always reasonable to say, I'll be happy to discuss that more with you offline. It's always very reasonable to say, this is how we decided to do it. You can agree or disagree, but these are our results. Again, being arrogant, being sarcastic, being defensive, these are all clues to the audience that they no longer have to be polite to you or your friend. So always keep your cool, always be polite, always, again, try and be prepared for any tough questions that may come your way.
Thank you so much again for the pearls of wisdom. The final comment is, Dr. Sledge, please ask San Antonio, ASCO, ESMO, and everyone else that you should send your slides and be invited as a speaker. So it looks like it was very well received. Thank you so much again for the excellent presentation.
Well, my pleasure, and happy to share my slides with anyone who would like them.
This concludes the workshop. Thank you again.